Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. Today, this is I believe, sixth in the series called Jacobites. Uh, we are discussing Alexander Pope and the Jacobites today. Most people at the moment, if they know anything at all about Jacobitism, think of it as a romantic failure. They may know the bodice-ripping TV series Outlander, which depicts James II's grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as a deluded ninny leading good Scotsmen to ruination and death. The scriptwriters basically equate the concept of divine right of kings with a god complex. The prince appears as a degenerate, exhibiting all the dedicated immorality the Ancien Regime is charged with. An Alexander McCall Smith novel introduces Jacobite characters for the sole purpose of mocking their obscure and outmoded ideas. The doomed old cause of the royal Stuarts, to use Mencius Moldbug's phrase, is misty with nostalgia and futility. Its representation as quixotic, at best, goes back to Sir Walter Scott's 1814 novel Waverley. And yet, Jacobitism was once a solidly mainstream position. It was during the reign of Queen Anne, which ran from 1701 to 1714, that the Jacobite heir to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland was favored by a huge portion of elites. By tracking the life of one of Queen Anne's most strategically placed subjects, the great neoclassical poet Alexander Pope, we can get a sense of why this was. Alexander Pope's earliest years were profoundly influenced by the fortunes of James II. Pope's father, a prosperous London linen merchant, was a recent convert to the Catholic faith. His mother was related to the miniaturist Samuel Cooper. Catholics were very much a minority in England, but when James came to the throne in 1685 and ever more courtiers embraced his faith, many expected that the laws restricting those who held to the old religion, the recusants, would soon be repealed. The Test Acts banned recusants, together with nonconformist Protestants, from teaching, attending school or university, voting, or holding public office. Catholics and nonconformists, these were the groups King James hoped could cooperate. He hoped in vain. In 1688, the year of the poet's birth, James was deposed by the Whigs in favor of his Protestant nephew and son-in-law, the Dutch Prince William of Orange. Pope was won when James's troops met William's in Ireland, ultimately suffering defeat at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. Once again, James retreated to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the court in exile which had served the Stuarts so often in the turbulent 17th century. These events cast a long shadow over English Catholics. Now their fortunes fell into eclipse again. But the Pope family remained loyal to the Church, working to strengthen the network of recusant families that had first taken shape when the faith was driven underground in the 16th century. As it was now illegal for them to live within 10 miles of London, Pope's father took his wife and young son to live in Windsor. Despite showing great early promise, Pope could not, owing to his religion, attend nearby Eton College. Instead, he was educated by his community. His aunt taught him to read, and the family priest tutored him in Latin and Greek. Pope was translating Homer at the age of 6, showing a facility with great epic poetry that would serve him well in future. The boy was nicknamed the Little Nightingale for his beautiful singing voice. Later he attended several of the clandestine dissenting academies developed by Catholics on the one hand and various nonconformist groups on the other. Additionally, Pope faced a major disadvantage of a different order. At 12, he was diagnosed with Pott's disease, or spinal tuberculosis. It severely stunted his growth to 4'6" and left him with chronic asthma and migraines. Despite these apparent restrictions, Pope flourished in society. Though very small indeed, he had fine features and an attractive demeanor. Witty and articulate as well as affectionate, the poet had a knack for friendship. His closest companion was the charming and fashionable Martha Blount, shown at left, a family friend from among the closely interconnected Catholic gentry. Martha is thought to have attended an underground convent school in Hammersmith. Pope once wrote to her from the spa town of Bath, declaring that if she would join him, she would make the best mermaid in Christendom. Pope often shared his poetry with Martha and her siblings. Modeling himself on John Dryden, the towering Restoration literary figure, Pope was perfecting the heroic couplet. He also shared Dryden's taste for occasional verse and satire. It bears mentioning that Dryden, a convert to Catholicism, had been poet laureate until 1689. He was punished for refusing to take an oath to the newly installed William and Mary. Still, Dryden recovered his fortunes after foregoing the laurels. So for someone like Pope, the elder poet was exemplary in more ways than one. The professions and most forms of patronage were closed to religious dissidents. Encouraged by friends, Pope innovated a solution. Having produced a fresh translation of Homer's Iliad, he sold it on subscription. This model proved successful, and he later did the same with the Odyssey. In this way, Pope became financially independent. He was able to buy a house in Twickenham near his Tory friend Henry St. John, later Lord Bolingbroke, the dedicatee of his Essay on Man. The house boasted miniature sculptured gardens, a spring, and a grotto decorated with mirrors. Were it to have nymphs as well, he remarked, it would be complete in everything. The poet was now positioned to write what he liked in a setting tailored to inspire him. For this reason, Alexander Pope is classified as England's first professional writer. In some ways, he thrived, not despite, but because of his limitations. Pope penned his famous mock epic, The Rape of the Lock, as a favor to his community and sent it to Martha Blount for her approval. A serious rift over a small incident had emerged between two prominent Catholic families, and a friend asked Pope for a poem to lighten the mood. What had happened was this. A young nobleman, Lord Peter, had infuriated a young lady, Arabella Fermor, by cutting off a lock of her hair without permission. A row ensued, and gradually friends and relations had been drawn into the conflict. Soon, the two families were completely at odds. As the beleaguered dissident subculture could scarcely afford this kind of discord, Lord Peter, for one, was barred from taking his seat in the House of Lords due to his religion. It was hoped that a comic poem could reconcile the warring parties and restore harmony. Casting the episode as the ultimate tempest in a teapot, Pope marshals the classic devices of epic poetry. For example, the capture of the lock of hair is likened to the seizing of Helen of Troy. The poet invokes the muse, quote, "What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests arise from trivial things? I sing this verse to Carol, muse, is due. Say, what motive, goddess, could compel a well-bred lord to assault a gentle belle? Oh, say what stranger cause, yet unexplored, could make a gentle belle reject a lord?" Pope hoped that The Rape of the Lock would reshape his community after the manner of festive comedy, purging disorder and renewing concord. poet moved confidently in mainstream circles as well. He traveled regularly to London to enjoy its burgeoning coffeehouse culture. The city's first coffee stall had been opened by a Greek immigrant in 1652. By 1710, there were hundreds of coffee houses buzzing with conversation. They attracted the literati. Pope once spotted his hero, John Dryden, at Will's Coffee House, as well as the so-called coffee house politicians, caffeinated wits holding forth on the questions of the day. Pamphlets, newspapers, and magazines were freely available there, avatars of political parties and alliances. At one point, he was keeping company with Whig writers Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, who co-founded The Spectator in 1711, but rapidly threw in his lot with the Tories. He later joined forces with Tory thinkers, forming the Scribblerus Club, in order to satirize fellow writers and politicians. Pope's The Dunciad, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and John Gay's The Beggar's Opera formed a three-pronged attack on First Minister Robert Walpole's Whiggish dominion in Parliament. Indeed, Pope's later satirical verses grew so biting and so popular that he began to make enemies. Whenever he walked his Great Dane, Bounce, he had to take a pair of pistols for protection. He declared open season on Walpole and other Whigs, but he wrote admiringly of Queen Anne. In the early patriotic pastoral Windsor Forest, Anne appears as a second Elizabeth I, bringing calm and unity after the turbulent years of the previous century, with its regicide, fire, and plague. Referencing sacred Charles's tomb, the poet exclaims, "O fact accursed! What tears has Albion shed? Heavens, what new wounds, and how her old have bled! She saw her sons with purple deaths expire, her sacred domes involved in rolling fire, a dreadful series of intestine wars, inglorious triumphs, and dishonest scars. At length great Anna said, 'Let discord cease.' She said, the world obeyed, and all was peace." William and Mary had, naturally enough, trusted the Whigs, who brought them to power. Their successor preferred the Tories. And Queen Anne was something of a Jacobite. She felt guilty about the dethroning of her father, James II, who had died in 1701, just a few months after William. She sympathized with her young half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart. The party system of Whigs and Tories had first emerged in response to the question of who would succeed Charles II. Because Anne was childless and nearing middle age, the succession question was center stage once more. Since marrying Prince George of Denmark, Anne had suffered many miscarriages. One child, Prince William, had survived, only to die of a complicated ailment age 11. In the black comedic film The Favorite, these lost children are symbolized by an ever-growing flock of pet rabbits. As Anne's health was poor, the elites set about choosing the next monarch. There were three basic positions among the political class. Those who rejected the claims of James Francis outright, due to his religion, most Whigs. Those who were unhappy with his Catholicism, but saw his claims as persuasive, most Tories. And those Tories who saw him as the rightful king, full stop, the Jacobites. As for the common people, lineage still went a long way. The Whigs had worked hard since the Exclusion Crisis to privilege Protestantism over lineage by stirring up rumors, demonstrations, and violence galore. They were at pains to obscure the glaring fact that James Francis was the heir apparent. Lord Bolingbroke wrote to James Francis in exile, asking whether he might convert to the state religion, Anglicanism, to no avail. I have chosen my own course, he replied. Therefore, it is for others to change their sentiments. Bolingbroke's heart must have sunk. One might just as well ask why Catholicism was anathema for these people. The 1689 Bill of Rights had baked Protestantism into the British Constitution. Quote, "It hath been found by experience that it is inconsistent with the safety and welfare of this Protestant kingdom to be governed by a papist prince," it reads. There follows a list of charges against James II. Of course, the vast majority of English kings had been papist for the simple reason that the English Reformation had only occurred in 1534. Magna Carta, a document the Whigs considered foundational to their enterprise, was drawn up under a medieval Catholic order, but papistry or popery in this context means something more than a certain religious practice, although, as we know, they had mountains of objections to that. It had something to do with the fact that the papacy is itself a monarchy. The key fact is the routine association between the word papistry and the phrase arbitrary rule. This collocation of papistry and arbitrary rule gets to the heart of the Whigs' political project. Much as their predecessors had done with the Catholic Church, the Whigs now recast traditional kingship as somehow inalienable to Britain. Somehow alien to Britain. The word arbitrary paints this form of rule as groundless, whereas in fact it is intrinsic to the transcendent order of the great chain of being, and therefore deeply rooted in the culture. Power flows downwards from God. In the human realm, it flows downwards from the monarch. In the final analysis, his word goes, but as Sir Robert Filmer argued, he is responsible for his people just as a father is responsible for his family. The traditional model of kingship works in tandem with the church. Bishops invest kings. This is also true of Anglican kings, which is why the Puritans and their Whiggish descendants tended to attribute papistry to Anglican kings like James I and Charles I, as well as Catholic ones like James II, didn't actually need to be explicitly Catholic in order to be considered papist. The Whigs' charge of papistry meant ruling in the manner of Louis XIV or Charles II of Spain. Arbitrary rule was something for Frenchmen or Spaniards. The Whigs were on their way to refashioning British kings into mere figureheads for parliamentary rule. "Peace and plenty tell, a Stuart reigns," wrote Alexander Pope of Anne's Great Britain. But the Whigs drew the line at the Stuart they first smeared as the warming pan baby and then the old pretender. When Queen Anne died in 1714, Whig lords flooded into her bedchamber to prevent Lord Bolingbroke from declaring for James Francis Edward Stuart, and instead proclaimed the Elector of Hanover as George I, King of Great Britain. They had passed over more than 50 closer candidates until they found a Protestant. I would argue that, far from regretting this, the Whigs embraced George because his kingship would disrupt Sir Robert Filmer's vision of the monarch as patriarch. How could so remote a figure be father of the British? Lord Bolingbroke sailed to France, joining James Francis at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. From here he would plan the 1715 Jacobite uprising. What did Alexander Pope make of all this? He was a Tory sympathizer, suspected of Jacobite sympathies as well. He was Bolingbroke's intimate. However, only Anglicans could afford to be open Jacobites. Although he might favor the Jacobite heir, in theory, He knew his country could fracture and explode into civil war as it had done more than once in the previous century. We get a sense of Pope's perspective from the following passage, written to a friend who wished to convert him to Protestantism. Quote, I'll tell you my politic and religious sentiments in few words. In my politics, I think no further than how to preserve the peace of my life in any government under which I live, nor in my religion than to preserve the peace of my conscience in any church with which I communicate. I hope all churches and all governments are so far of God, as they are rightly understood and rightly administered, and where they are or may be wrong, I leave it to God alone to mend or reform them, which, whenever he does, it must be by greater instruments than I am. Unquote. This points to the classic conundrum for reactionaries. The respect for hard-won political order wins out over other preferences. Pope prioritized harmony and stability. It was one thing to favor the Jacobite heir if he could come to power through orderly succession. It was quite another to violently overthrow a sitting monarch. For a period, a peaceful transfer of power had been possible. But now that George I was on the throne, that window had closed. Jacobitism now meant rebellion. Thanks for listening. Please do comment below and stay tuned for the next Jacobite episode.